Good afternoon, everybody. This is Sarah Richmond here from Above the Tree Line, the company that makes Edelweiss. We are super excited today. I mean, we're data nerds here, so but we are very excited to talk about data-driven collection development. I have on the phone with me Ruth Bradstreet, who's our product manager over our analytics tools for libraries, for publishers, for retail. She does it all, but we have kind of some new insights. We've started looking at our own data and the client's data differently and found some really interesting things. And we just presented this over at Book Expo just almost a week or two ago, and had a great conversation there with librarians that were in attendance and kind of are excited to talk about that today. So I'm going to let Ruth do most of the talking. I might jump in here or there, and at the same time I'm going to answer questions that anyone has. Feel free to enter in questions into the Q&A portion or the chat portion. If we don't get to something today, we'll of course reach out with you and personally afterwards. So definitely feel free to ask questions, and I'll pass it over to Ruth.
All right, thanks, Sarah, and welcome everybody. And like Sarah said, we're pretty excited about this stuff because we're big data nerds. So I hope there's some other data nerds on the phone, and that the description of this session, data-driven collection development, is something that gets you interested and grabbed your attention. We've spent 16 years as a company exploring and working with these kinds of concepts. So that's what we're going to talk about, how to make collection development easier and more effective by using data, much of which you probably already have. And we'll also share, as Sarah said, some interesting facts and findings from our own research and work with libraries across the country so far, so that you can kind of retrieve some tidbits and maybe some things that could add some perspective to your own work now. And generally, our goal is to spark some interest in digging into your own ILS data and hopefully generating some thoughts about how you might look at your data a bit differently from before. So the agenda today is going to be sort of about our approach to collection development, data-driven collection development, the cool insights that we're finding by comparing a lot of data from various libraries, and then some ideas about applying it at your library. I'm going to talk about your library a lot too, as I'm actually looking at data from a demo library, but I'll probably keep referring to your library. Anyway, we could talk about this data stuff for hours. We have an hour, so I'm going to try to keep it tight and not go on and on too much, but Sarah will stop me if I do. So, but just as a quick intro, Above the Tree Line, who are we? So we're not actually a tree trimming company, as we are often mistaken for, but we're a software company, and our mission is really to help the book industry see the forest for the trees by getting a panoramic view of their operations to save time and money so that you can work better and read more, which is kind of our tagline, our motto. And we're located in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan, founded in 2002 by the son of an indie bookseller and grandson of a librarian. That's our founder and CEO, John Rubin. And we're still independent and still fairly small, about 25 people. And it's a platform that, a digital catalog platform where all the major publishers and lots of other publishers post their front list and lots of their backlist titles in the form of kind of digital catalogs. It's a very popular platform used by bookstores, librarians, book reviewers, book enthusiasts. You just go to the website. Notes and
Hey Ruth, are you able to hear me?
That is aimed at collection development. Edelweiss Plus Analytics is essentially an add-on module where collection analysis tools are really integrated directly into Edelweiss now. So we're not really here to do a sales pitch of analytics, but I'll leave you with some information at the end. But we just wanted to sort of explain a little bit about why we have all this data and where it's coming from, essentially. So I thought it'd be helpful to sort of set the stage by talking about some of the concepts we've been refining throughout the years, not just around the science of collection development itself, but also around how and when to look at things so that collection development is easy and actionable and even possibly fun. So our overarching philosophy around collection development is trying to put the most relevant information in the hands of the people that know the library and the patrons the best to help in decision making. Not to have the numbers and software make decisions for you or tell you what to do. Everybody's got different libraries, different perspectives, but we want to be able to present you with the data in a manageable and sensical form that you can really use and make decisions yourself. So one famous quote from Peter Drucker is, of course, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it, which I have found to be very true. So a lot of what we're going to talk about here is measuring, and we, whether it's quantitatively or qualitatively, we're measuring things all the time. And the catch is, are you measuring the right things? If you don't have data, it's really hard to measure a collection of thousands or hundreds of thousands of titles. We really just can't keep that kind of data in our heads, especially if you include the concepts of tracking hot titles and trends outside of your library. So what data should you measure? Your ILS system has a ton of information in it, but looking at lists and reports out of an ILS can be tricky, just getting a list of things to action. So what we've done is to distill down to what we think are just really good indicators of a collection's health and into 4 separate measures or metrics. And the idea, or at least our idea, is that if you do these 4 things well, we'd really bet with a high degree of certainty that your collection is working well for your patrons as well. So what are these 4 metrics behind these 4 doors? First one is freshness. This is what we're referring to as kind of the difference between fresh and stale in your collection. So what proportion of your collection has been active in the last couple of years? A higher proportion, you're more fresh, and a lower proportion, you have more stale titles. So this little graph here is showing you, for example, from our reporting, it could tell you that there's X number of stale titles and that some portion of those are actually have been inactive for maybe more than 8 years, as it shows you in that little graph there. Second metric is this idea of relevance. And this is where we bring in some retail data for comparison. So this is going to tell you whether or not you have the titles in your collection that are actually selling out there in bookstores. So it kind of brings the demand to you, a bit more information about demand rather than waiting for your patrons to ask for things. So we kind of frame that as relevance of your collection, and do you have the titles that are doing well? It's not really so much about the ones you have that are not doing well, but more about what percentage of the titles that are doing well out there in the marketplace do you have? If you have a low percentage of those, there's a good chance that you're missing some circulations and some patron demand that's out there. So for example, this is showing 286 missing titles, and you can tell that from that first one, there's 182 that are missing in between, that are missing from, I should say, your collection. I said I would keep saying your collection, but I don't mean yours. But if you're reading this about your collection, 182 missing from your collection that have sold in between 10 and 20% of bookstores in recent months. And then there's 91 that have sold between 20 and 50. And then the real zinger is that there are 13 titles that are selling well out there in the marketplace. Over 50% of the independent bookstores have sold this book, and you don't have it at all. Not any versions of it. We join all the versions together. So there's 13 titles that we can tell you don't have that may be quick wins to add to the collection. Hit rate. So this is about recent titles, recent pub date titles, and titles that have been recently bought into the collection in the last year or so. So what proportion of those titles have circulated? So it's always a bit of a crapshoot buying, picking out new titles, especially. So some of them are going to arrive and just never circulate. So in this is showing me that 10% of these 94 in this sample library, 10% or 10 titles are showing as DOA, as in dead on arrival. So they arrived, but they have not circed. And then some of them are sort of moderately circulated or have circulated in moderately, I guess. And 12 of them are showing good circulation. So that's sort of a measure of success of selection, essentially. So that's also something that we think is sometimes a little obscured and hard to really know and get metrics on, like how well you're doing, essentially, at selecting new titles. And the fourth one here is turnover, something you'd be more familiar with, just the concept of how many times your collection turns over annually. So your circulation relative to the holdings that you have in the collection. And some of the stats down there actually showing for a particular genre or category. That's why they're small, but it's showing that, for example, in the sample, we have a 10% relative use for a particular category, whereas my peers have I'm sorry, not 10%, 0.10%, really tiny because it's a small category, whereas my peers have a higher percentage of relative use. So that tells me something there that, we'll get into that. There's a lot of this is coming down to benchmarking against peers. And then showing the same kind of thing for holdings. Holdings are pretty similar to peers. The percent of circulation is quite a bit below peers. And the average copies, though, is also below peers. So those are the four metrics. And the next, I'm going to sort of dive into one of the other pages of our reporting and open up with another cool quote that may be less famous, but a goal properly set is halfway reached. That was Zig Ziglar. So in other words, deciding what you want to do, deciding on those goals and how you want to change the collection, and setting those goals, you're halfway to actually achieving them, because the hard work is in figuring that part out, or at least half of the hard work is. So yeah, measuring is one thing, but setting those goals or having a goal in mind isn't always as easy, though. You want to be better than you've been in the past, and whatever better means, and increase circulation or turnover. But how fresh should a section be, for example? And what should you shoot for in terms of turnover for your biography section, for example? And this is where, as I mentioned, the peer data really comes in and can be extremely helpful. And we've built that in as a key component of how we look at data-driven collection development. And what's so cool about looking at peers is that you can see how a genre like art and architecture tends to circulate, and evaluate your collection based on those indicators, rather than comparing your genres or parts of the collection to each other and kind of judging them in that and then dismissing that judgment. So in other words, if you're, the other quote in there says, don't measure apples to oranges, or I suppose compare them. So if you're kind of looking at comparing your graphic novels to your poetry section, obviously there's going to be a big disparity. So, and you're going to say, well, that's just how it is. Of course, that's what we'd expect, and we're not going to really change that. And you'd say probably something like, if I don't put words in your mouth, like most libraries don't have a terribly, probably have technically an overstocked poetry section. And that's true. And that's kind of what's interesting about this, is we can kind of see that kind of most libraries assertion right in here. So this page, what you're looking at, if you can see, there's a lot of dots, but if you can imagine, the gray dot is an average. So that is the average library benchmark in terms of relevance. So again, if you go back to those four metrics, relevance is the one that is telling me whether or not we have titles that are doing well in the marketplace, so some top selling titles, for example. So the gray dots the gray dots are the average. So you can see for art and architecture that number is fairly low. The range is down at 7%. So in other words, the average library does not have a lot of relevant titles, if that makes sense. So you can say if you're, and then the colored dots are the sample library or your library. So any of the colors are your own, and they're kind of either above or below the gray dot to kind of give you an indication of where you stand relative to the average. So in other words, this art and architecture is showing a dot where as the legend at the bottom shows you, is moderately below the average. So you could say, okay, well, no, of course, nobody else really circulates art and architecture super well, or maybe nobody else really has the really current books because they're expensive and we can't really keep up with it, and we want to keep a big kind of historical collection of some beautiful big art books that don't really circulate. And you can see that's true. So everybody else would probably say the same thing, but in your case, you're below that. Even then, you're kind of below the average. So you might say, well, that's true, but possibly we could improve things. So you're particularly bad here in bad. It's not. I don't want to make a judgment, but in terms of relevance. So that might be a place where you could say, okay, well, just tell me what the top selling art and architecture books are, and I'll see if there's something there that we really ought to have that we're just missing. And if you start doing that kind of thing and maybe pulling out some of the older ones and weeding them, you can fairly quickly shift that metric and move that along. And then you'll see if you go down further that one of the biggest disparities there is between the average at this library and, the average across libraries and this library's collection of business and economics, which is above average in relevance. So they're paying attention to new books that are coming out in business and popular books and doing a good job of staying on top of that part of the collection. But it is interesting to see how close some of these things are. I'll talk about that a little bit more. In terms of, close in terms of library, the average library being, or the demo library being fairly close to the average library is what I'm trying to say for particular genres. Something I might want to add here is that, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is in terms of genre. This particular reporting is really all in books. That's kind of our specialty. So we're focusing on the book part of the collection. Because of the Edelweiss product, we have a ton of book information. We have a ton of content about books, metadata, publisher information, publisher marketing, all that kind of stuff, because people are using it in the retail market as their sales tool and their buying tool. So that means that we have BISAC categories for almost everything. If you're familiar with BISAC, that's a categorization system that's used on the retail side of the book industry, subject categorization. And it's a really nice way, and I know because in libraries with Dewey, it can be tricky to find, especially genres of fiction, and to kind of group those together without doing your own work in those. So essentially what we're doing to be able to compare across, we have to use a common measurement or a common categorization system. So these genres are based on BISAC. They're not exactly BISAC. They're often combinations. BISAC is not really evenly distributed in terms of how many titles match the main ones. So we've just kind of leveled that out a little bit. So I'm talking in terms of BISAC. And if you're wondering about sending us data and would you need to send us data in BISAC, just to anticipate one of the questions, because this came up when we talked at Book Expo, you wouldn't need to tell us BISAC for anything because we know that. Anyway, so let's look at this one. So we've kind of consolidated these concepts of measuring and benchmarking into this data collection, the collection reporting. So I'm going to show you some of the interesting findings we've seen from the product in a bit, but this data collection report is is part of a lightweight version of our analytics service. It's called the Basecamp version, and it hooks up to many of the major ILS systems and aggregates this information into this kind of interactive report, which can be run either monthly, quarterly, or every 6 months. The beauty of that is that you can see the changes over time. So if you're able to take some actions to sort of rectify some issues in a particular part of the collection. Hopefully you'll be able to see that difference in these 4 measures in the next reporting. So it tracks these key performance metrics over time, as I just said, benchmarking against peer libraries and the genres I mentioned. And then you can do it for all different branches or all branches combined. And there's also a way to compare branches to each other across certain genres. So you can see if a particular branch is in a very different place with a particular genre than the other branches, for example. And then the end point of this is not just looking at these reports, although you can certainly print them and look at these nice things. All of those pieces at the bottom are where you can see 10 stale titles and the missing titles that we talked about. You can click on and get to a list of titles. So that's actually giving you an actionable list of books that you could maybe weed, maybe bring into the collection, maybe just review to see how they're selling, to see how they're circling elsewhere. So it gives you that level of action that you can take. So to move on to cool insights from other public libraries, at least we think they're cool. We'll see if you think that or not. So this is Library A, for example, and the tagline for Library A is that you are not alone. And this kind of gets to what I was talking about before a little bit with the fact that the average, that many libraries are very close to the average. So it shows, this one shows kind of 2 examples, how different genres have really different performance levels between them, right? There's a big difference between literary collections here and comics and graphic novels, for example. So they're quite different, which, that's kind of the, the explanation I was talking about earlier as to everybody is like that. But it also shows how closely one particular library, in this case, adheres to those averages. So you can see, again, the gray dot is the average, and anything that's a colored dot is this particular library. And this is sort of a top-level look at a bunch of these genres. So you're seeing that in some cases, the yellow dot, the yellow ones means it's very close to the average. So in those cases, sometimes they're practically like art and architecture. It's almost completely on top of the gray dot. So they're, remarkably average in some ways. And we find that really interesting, that some libraries are very, very close to the average and some are quite diverse. But typically we find that libraries are more alike in a way in their collections than bookstores are, which I thought first was surprising, but now I've decided that's not surprising, maybe just because I have the facts. And as I mentioned, so that you can kind of see the ranges here. So, but what it's sort of telling you is that, like I said, you're not alone, and using this peer data can actually help you set better goals because you can get some idea of where you are compared to the average, and that you can't have the same expectations for literary collections that you would have for comics and graphic novels. So you see over in the right, literary collections is, again, this is one where this library dot is right on the average, but it's on the lower end of freshness. This is the metric we're looking at the moment, is freshness. So everybody has a lot of stale copies of titles sitting on the shelf, classified as literary collections. That's not uncommon, and that may well be completely justified, which probably is, right? And then on the other hand, you've got comics and graphic novels where the average is fairly high, so things are moving fairly quickly. There's not a lot of sort of older dead collections or parts of the collection or extra copies. And in the case of this library, they're even more that way. So their comics and graphic novels collection is more fresh than average, so they can sort of take some pride in really paying attention to that section. And then down in youth, you can see that there's just, again, very average. And that poetry we talked about before, and the left-hand side poetry in this case is way below. So let's look at Library B. And this one is different. You can tell is not nearly as average. So you'll see that there's kind of consistency across the major parts of the collection. So, in this case too, we're using the turnover metric. So we switched metrics now from freshness to turnover. So you can see the nonfiction genres, so the left-hand side column essentially, are consistently at or above the peer average for turnover. So their turnover for a ton of adult, well, for really adult nonfiction is generally speaking out of much higher than is typical. But if you go over to the other broad parts of the collection, adult fiction is pretty average, and youth is showing, you can just tell by the color coding that youth is below. So essentially, those little boxes on the left is telling me that there are 9 genres in adult nonfiction that are significantly above average, and there's 11 genres that are above average, and there's a few that are average, and there's none that are below. Adult fiction shows there's 8 that are average, so again, they're very average. Again, you can kind of just tell by looking at the colors. And then in youth, you can see here that there's 8 that are moderately below average. So it kind of makes you wonder, like, I'm sure the librarians for this library would know exactly what this meant right away, and maybe this is completely intended. So it could be just something structural about the library in the way that, it could be literally structural in the sense that all of the youth stuff is down in the basement and doesn't get searched nearly as much as it should be because of its location, or it could be something to do with the way that the collection and selection of titles is structured in the library. It could be just something about this community. It could be almost a demographic thing. So you might say, oh, this particular branch, so say I'm looking at a branch, you may say, this is because this branch is in that neighborhood that's really basically old people, pretty much. And so we just don't do as well with youth. And then you can sort of, if that's if you want to keep it that way, of course you can, and be ready for a change in demographic. Or you might say, let's look at this and see if we could kind of make our numbers look a little bit better, or maybe serve the community a bit better by making some space from the youth sections, and maybe stocking a little bit more in the nonfiction genres where we're doing so well. So it's not anything about blame, right or wrong. It's just kind of like, this is what we present you, and you can sort of decide what that means and if it's completely expected or not. But it does sort of validate some of our concepts in the sense that the average turn for youth is higher than nonfiction, but the peer data shows that's more of a function of the genre dynamics themselves than performance. So in other words, the nonfiction dots, gray dots, are fairly far to the left. So typically, they're not terribly high turning genres, whereas youth typically are. So it kind of validates what we were saying earlier about the way that those things kind of merge together and have patterns. So let's move on. Library C. So this one, the heading for this is more top sellers, they work. What's interesting here, I think it might be a bit hard to see those tiny graphs, but what's happening in this library is a little bit like the slide before. I'm showing you how many categories in adult fiction are above average. There's 8 above average, and then only a couple that are average or below. And then there's 7 that are above average in turn. So essentially, I should backtrack a little bit. So essentially, one of the things we're finding is that that top one is relevance. So there's a connection here between relevance and turnover. So we can't necessarily say there's a cause and effect, but what we can say is that libraries like this library, where they do have a more relevant collection in adult fiction, have a higher turn in adult fiction. And maybe that just stands to reason that's going to happen, but does kind of tell you the effect of top sellers in the sense of like, that's why we call them more top sellers. So so they kind of correspond in an interesting way. And then if you move along to youth, you can see that they are more average in youth. So the relevance for youth titles is average, but the turnover for youth titles is also average. So, you know, they're connected, obviously. Perhaps if an action to take in this case is to find some titles for the youth sections that are really popular and selling right now that you may not have, and kind of bump that up to be above average. And the same kind of thing in adult nonfiction, where there's 17 categories that are average because it's the highly average area. And again, that might be something where an average in terms of relevance, I should go back to saying that. So in other words, they're fine. They've got many of the top selling titles, but they still don't have some of them. And maybe boosting that percentage of top selling titles would do something to the turnover there. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me see. Yeah, so obviously they're sort of like, I think I sort of said this already, but the sought out and kind of high demand titles are in there in fiction. They have them, and then it seems to be reflected in their turn. So one of the things that, oh, actually, let's move on to the next one. Sorry, I'll save that thought for later. Okay, so library D, and I promise this is the last one. It doesn't go all the way through the alphabet, but this is library D. And the concept here is the idea of swapping out the stale. So one thing that we found successful in bookstores, it doesn't necessarily correlate, but is also, I mean, it is certainly true in libraries to a certain extent too, is that you can, one easy thing, kind of a low-hanging fruit of improving or boosting circulation or boosting turnover, especially in a part of a collection, is to take out some titles that are really not circling. Those would be the stale things, and maybe replace them. And even if it's just a few at one end of the very, very stale titles and a few at the very top end of things that are selling well, and just switch those out, maybe merchandise the new ones in a nice way, and see if that just changes the poetry section. So this is one where the poetry section's just really not looking so hot. So if we drill into what they actually have that's really old, so you can see on the left-hand side, they have 181 titles that are stale for between 4 and 8 years stale. They haven't had any kind of action during in over 4 years, essentially. And then the right-hand side, we've got things that have been selling well. So there's titles that they don't have, but they have been selling. I mean, there's titles this library doesn't have in its holdings, but are selling in bookstores, I should say. So if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see some things, and you may look at this and go, well, it's poetry. We really have to keep certain things. Like, we're not going to get rid of the Divine Comedy. But you've also got some more information on the left-hand side too, where you've got percentages sold and on hand and on order, this time in the retail market, or currently in the retail market. So you'll see that first book, the Margaret Atwood one, has sold in 2% of bookstores. The other ones are at 0. So you might say, well, Margaret Atwood poetry, I mean, it's Margaret Atwood and she's really hot right now, and some bookstores are selling this. So that might be one you would not target for weeding, but there could be some other things at the top of this list that you could weed or go and look at, or you could go and check out the Margaret Atwood and see if it's just in really bad shape or if it's missing or something, and see if you can't do something to help that book. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the big books in poetry by the big poets, I guess. So typically for other categories, these would tend to be front list titles or newer titles from the last couple of years. Poetry, they're a bit more variable, so that Mary Oliver book that's at the top, bookstores are selling that really well. It's 2004 book, but it's still selling currently really quite well. I just read recently that she is the best-selling poet in the United States. So it might be, you might think, well, why don't we have that Mary Oliver? Maybe we ought to. And same thing with that second one down, almost half the bookstores have have it, and half of them have sold it recently. I read that she is an up-and-coming young poet, so that might be worth looking into. And then the third one is Billy Collins. Again, he's a very popular poet. Why not have a copy of that one? So you could choose, several of these. There may be reasons you don't want them or whatever, but to sort of substitute in some. So this concept of swapping out the stale. And I think if you did that in this case, the poetry section would see a real bump in its performance. Or maybe I shouldn't say performance, in its activity and circulation and satisfaction in the end for your patrons. So applying it to your library. So general recommendations, as I said, is kind of being aware of the differences between genres, and that one size doesn't fit all. These genres have characteristics all of their own outside of what's happening in individual libraries. The idea of weeding out some things, purchasing some new titles that you may never have had at all, and swapping those out to try and boost a part of the collection. And then really just using the data to identify the strengths and weaknesses in the collection and figuring out which areas to focus on. So that's part of the whole goal setting, deciding what you're going to do and then acting on that. We do have a trial, I'll just mention now, for particular ILSs, especially Evergreen, Symphony Horizon, Library Solutions, and Polaris. If you're interested in this state of the collection reporting, we can do that now for a 90-day trial if you have one of those ILSs. And of course, we have sort of the ultimate summit version as well. So we have essentially 3 versions right now of analytics for libraries. The Alpine version is one where you just see those percentages, like percent of stores that a book has sold in, or percent of libraries that a book has been searched in recently, and the holdings and the on hand at bookstores. So you can kind of see that information without having to send us any data. So if you're a selector, that might give you some more insight into titles you might want to pick up. The next level up is the Basecamp version I mentioned. It has the scorecard, the state of the collection included in that, but it also has some nice features kind of just baked into Edelweiss. So when you're in Edelweiss for selection or whatever you're doing, you'll be able to see things about your own library. You'll be able to see what you have in holdings for particular titles, if you have something, if you don't, just kind of at a glance. And some other cool features that go along with that. And then the top version there is our Summit version, which is a full analytics, we would call it, where you have a page of all kinds of charts and graphs that are dynamic, and you can kind of operate as you go, instead of kind of the more static reporting that we have. And you can it's got special functions for weeding and all kinds of things. I'll show you a bit more about that. And then to sort of emphasize what I mentioned earlier about comparisons, this is something, just to kind of wrap up a bit, where you're tracking performance at a high level with some of these tools, with the state of the collection tool in particular, because it's periodic. So this is kind of what it would look like. You can sort of take your reporting to stakeholders, a board, whoever, funders, and say, okay, this is what our performance was like in these Edelweiss metrics that everybody is using these days, hopefully something like that. And this is our action plan that came from that. And in the last quarter, we executed part or all of this action plan, and now we have sort of a delta between where we were and where we are, and we can see some changes, and hopefully changes for the better in the state of the collection itself. And it's something that's easy to show and to explain and to really measure the changes that you're making. Just to mention really quick about the Summit version, I said you can go in and there's lots of charts and graphs. It's all dynamic. We would get all your collection codes, and you can do a lot of comparisons within your own collection, and sort of really dig into the details of your collection, of comparing whatever you want to whoever you want, kind of thing, to see what you might want to be picking up or getting rid of, and compare locations to each other in a more in-depth way than the state of the collection reporting. So with that, I am going to turn this back over to Sarah to wrap things up. Are you there?
Thanks, Ruth. It's funny because I have watched, this presentation and you and John talk about sort of these insights that we've been learning as we've started to look at library data differently. But I learn something new every time. And so I'm a true data nerd at heart. I know that's what it says, but I have a lot of fun thinking about it. And as we talk to the libraries that are getting their first state of the collection reports, it's just really cool to see their own excitement and get their team excited and thinking about using their data differently just to make their lives easier. It's not just about just for fun looking at data differently, but also doing something with it and saving yourself some time and some money and maximizing your budget and all that good stuff. So anyway, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. We have abovethetreeline.com, and if you click in and read about the analytics, you have questions, there's forms on those pages, feel free to fill them out. You can also reach out to me directly if you want to at Sarah, S-A-R-A, at abovethetreeline.com. Happy to answer any questions that you have. So thanks for your time. We recorded today. I know we had a little sound issue in the beginning, so I'll see if I can figure that out for the recording and send that out for folks. But thanks for your patience with that. And thank you, Ruth, so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.